As far as I can tell, the only thing more polarizing than US politics is the Chainsaw Man anime adaptation. Whatever your opinion, whichever approach you might prefer, even if you just think they both look pretty good. Someone out there is just waiting to hate you for that opinion. But I'm just gonna try and talk briefly, but frankly, about what I liked and disliked about Season 1, how and why things are changing, how I think the approach seems to compare after staring at the trailers side by side with cuts from Season 1 for a frankly unhealthy amount of time, and of course why I am most of all just excited to get a Chainsaw Man movie. You were of course free to disagree with any of my keyword opinions, and yeah, let us pray that that's enough to keep me from getting a bunch of terrible YouTube comments. Even if I did have some issues with it, primarily as an adaptation, I still thoroughly enjoyed Season 1 of Chainsaw Man. But we finally got a look at the movie's second, more animation-heavy teaser trailer, and it looks totally insane, as we should rightfully expect, being that it's a movie and not a weekly TV series. We got some news about staff picks as well. Obviously, much of the staff, most notably the director, have changed. Now, I'm not going to discuss a bunch of individual staff today. I'm not really a Sakuga bro, and both probably pretentious and Senshi quickly drop some really good breakdowns of the new staff anyway, so you can always check those out.
The character designer is still Toto, but with Yoshihara being the new director, is really shying away with Nakayama's vision.
Licton, who is credited as the color script maker, they made the color scripts for what is probably the single most aesthetically pleasing sequence across the entirety of Jujutsu Kaisen.
What I do want to talk about is the kind of general direction that I think we can start to expect with how things are going to be adapted moving forward. Now, I mean no hate towards Ryu Nakayama, the director of Chainsaw Man Season 1. I think we got some awesome character acting, and the season's best action scenes were obviously fantastic. I don't think that anyone can rightfully complain about the level of production values that we got from the show at its best. Perhaps most importantly of all, it's Chainsaw Man, one of my favorite modern stories. And since I'm going to end up tearing into it more than praising it, because that's frankly just more interesting for comparison's sake, I'd like to once again say that I loved the first season. For all the undue hate Act 1 gets, even if I have some issues with how they handled plot beats and characterization, and even if I have some gripes about the visuals in certain scenes, to see so many scenes from one of my favorite modern stories rendered in this level of detail and dynamism is difficult to complain about, even if I think that many of us felt the weight of production issues in the dependence on CG and in the latter half of the season especially. And as long as we're on the topic, I've seen a lot of people who basically say that the 3D models were no detriment at all to the show's overall quality, and I have to say that I think those people are just smoking straight copium. This is not what they would have gone with under ideal conditions. Under ideal conditions, they would have animated the main subjects in 2D. We all know this, but I'll talk a bit more about why I feel this approach was probably unnecessary to begin with later on in the video. I did enjoy the somewhat subdued cinematic approach for most scenes. I thought that it was a fresh approach compared to most of what we get from modern anime, and I think that it would be perfectly suited for more grounded seinen series, sci-fi or dark fantasy anime in particular. But I must admit that I didn't really care for the muted colors. I also felt that the constant adherence to these consistent 3D-esque character renderings with the cinematic and relatively realistic vision seemed to somewhat soften the more comedic vibes of the manga. Yo, cutting in for just a second to say that I am not trying to claim that Nakayama's vision made all of the Chainsaw Man jokes unfunny. I still thought that the episode 4 cliffhanger was absolutely hilarious. I thought that both of the nut-kicking scenes were hilarious, obviously. And I thought that the vomit scene was particularly hilarious, especially with the laughing reaction from What's-Her-Face. All I'm saying is that I felt the cinematic realism made what could have felt more like moment-to-moment jokes into small talk vibes, I guess.
Dude, I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about.
I also felt that the constant adherence to these consistent 3D-esque character renderings with the cinematic and relatively realistic vision seemed to somewhat soften the more comedic vibes of the manga. Then again,
People make it seem like Nakayama's approach completely crushed artistic expression, which simply wasn't the case. Hironori Tanaka's art still looked like Hironori Tanaka's art. Takuya Ninuma's art still looked like Takuya Ninuma's art. Hisashi Mori's animation still looked like Hisashi Mori's animation. Keiichiro Watanabe's animation still looked like Keiichiro Watanabe's animation. Shota Goshizono's episode still featured the volumetric, quirky, eye-catching direction that he's known for. The list goes on. The anime simply did not look as uniform and consistent as many of you have convinced yourselves into believing. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
Also, I felt that there was a pretty basic failure to adapt the Cursed Devil moving in and out of the human world with its original effect intact, where it felt reminiscent to a fourth wall break in the manga. I talked at more length about some of these in other videos last year. There are all sorts of clever ways this could have been handled. Aspect ratio shifts, film strips with slow-mo, etc. The removal of certain scenarios that I thought were important for characterization in earlier chapters altered the way that both Makima and Denji would be perceived, and in my opinion actually veered more into mystery box vibes than the manga ever did. But most of these are of course less complaints about the product that we got and more about how it adapted one of my favorite manga. And once again, I still really enjoyed season 1. I really hope that Nakayama's studio is successful. Try to have some mercy on the dude, he's probably been through a lot. But obviously there was some specific intention in removing and replacing him for the adaptation, right?
Also, I'm sure some of you would love to believe that it was your collective outrage that led to Nakayama's departure, but I'm 99% sure that's not the case. You don't leave a project, start your own studio, and pick up a series of small works all in the span of a year or two. That stuff takes time. Nakayama was probably contracted for a single season, meaning his departure was pre-planned, at least I think it was. I have no sources, but it seems unlikely that a vocal minority crying about a director's work would lead to such a drastic production overhaul, that too in such a short period of time.
Nonetheless, new director, new direction, and we got a glimpse of that in the new trailer. The new director is Tatsuya Yoshihara, who has apparently worked on some of the most ambitious episodes in multiple modern shonen anime that I'm not watching.
He has been heavily involved with Chainsaw Man before, he was the action director.
But he also directed Wistoria most recently, which I thought was excellent, especially considering the fact that he was almost certainly on a tight timetable with it. Of course, needing to finish helming the direction of this movie. So what's that new direction looking like? Well, before rewriting much of this script, I decided that before making any broad brush declarations about the new direction, I should test my own intuitions as well as what I had heard from others about how the direction, the approach, and the general artistic stylings seemed to be changing and how they compared to season 1. So I actually combed through the entire series looking for some of the closest comparison shots I could find between the trailer's new cuts and scenes from season 1, trying to find shots with similar characters, lighting, location, angles, etc. I certainly had a large range of both successes and big stretches, stupidly attempting to compare every single scene. But you can check out all those comparison shots simply played back to back in this video I released a few days ago if that's something you're interested in, just seeing play out with no voiceover. But what were the biggest changes I actually noticed? Well, obviously, as everyone has said, it's brighter with more vibrant poppy colors. There's also a lot more variable line width, especially with all the thinner, finer detail lines, mostly on hair and clothing, but also on things like the occasional blushies. I feel as though we basically traded the detailed, more realistic facial line art and the very three-dimensional shadow work for these thin detail lines and all of the variable line width, since both are basically just different methods of creating more three-dimensional depth and overall character detail. The eye designs are also simpler, but once again, much more vibrant and poppy. And I'd say that these are all certainly more in line with the manga covers and digital color editions that I've read. We've also thus far seen no 3D chainsaws, although this isn't necessarily some guarantee that there are none. I think the anatomy might also be somewhat closer to the manga, though that point is very easy to exaggerate. Although there are absolutely exceptions to this, we've moved mostly away from the 3D-esque renderings of characters in Season 1, with mini-cuts almost completely shadowless, akin to some of JJK Season 2 more recently.
It's almost Kagenashi, but there's always the backlight shadows or other stuff that's present.
Also, there are obviously more liberties being taken with ideas of subtlety or realism. Reize completely soaked in the heavily saturated blue light in a perfectly lit nighttime scene, for example. Notice how much more subtle the mood lighting and colors are in similar Season 1 scenes. Once again, there are also a few scenes from the movie trailer that still retain most shadows/light sources. And there are also cuts that are far less pronounced with the smaller detail lines and variable line width. The cuts of Reize, for example, where you notice far less of the thinner hairlines. This is all to say that I think it's natural to expect exceptions to many of the changes we're all talking about more broadly speaking. And I think, as others have said, we can expect to see more animators coloring outside of the lines of the perceived vision of the movie, especially in big action scenes. Whereas in Season 1, things were typically required to be relatively realistic, consistently on model, and cinematic to fit Nakayama's directorial vision. It's once again easy to exaggerate any of these points though. There are, after all, only a handful of moments in the trailer where characters actually go off-model or we get big exaggerated foreshortening angles, for example. I, for one, had the immediate intuition that the visual comedy, in the same vein as the action scenes, had been loosened and exaggerated much more than what I found when I actually slowly compared the scenes of Denji and Kobeni, where the only real differences are that the colors are once again generally brighter and poppier, the approach to shadows and line work has changed, and to my surprise, the actual anatomy overall has only really been tweaked subtly, and still kept fairly consistent and on model as well. The Season 1 Denji hooray moment is ironically even more exaggerated than the one found in the movie trailer.
I guess irony can be pretty ironic sometimes.
Even if the camera work in the movie trailer might be much more bombastic and kinetic. On the Denji jump scream in particular, we also see that while the old one has a lot more of these kind of gritty and, for lack of a better term, ugly expressions, the new one is very clean, softly rounded, minimalistic, and ironically more consistent and on model when compared to the cuts from Season 1, the cinematic and typically more consistent 3D-esque show. I do think that the more poppy, minimalist art style still lends itself a bit better to comedy scenes, but it certainly isn't as huge of an overall difference for the comedic cuts as I suspected before I actually did the comparisons. This idea that we're going to get wacky, hyper-expressive, stylized visual comedy just because we're getting elements of that visual freedom in the action might mostly be cope.
The controversial Ryu Nakayama has left the project. He went on to create his own studio called Andraft, and he has been replaced by the one and only Tatsuya Yoshihara. More about his style, the way he stages and frames a scene, especially a non-action scene, is not that different from Nakayama. Both rely on complex cinematic layouts and camera tricks. However, when it comes to action, their approaches are very different. Still, there is a certain degree of uniformity in Yoshihara's works. Yes, this movie is a departure from Nakayama's strict reinforcement, but that doesn't mean the movie will automatically turn into Mob Psycho or a Masaki Yuasa work. Some degree of reinforcement will be present, regardless of the change in directorial ambition.
You can't keep getting away with it!
This point about only small, subtle differences in anatomy is also made blatantly apparent when you place these two images of Makima side by side, at which point I think you'll realize that they're still almost identical, setting aside the other factors that we spoke about earlier. Brightness, contrast, vibrant colors, line work, the eyes, etc. This is also all to say once again, I don't think we're necessarily giving up either end of the spectrum entirely, just getting a different mix with a different overall design sense and aesthetic. After these comparisons, maybe I'm crazy, but I actually find the level of focus on this idea that the cinematic vibe is totally dead to be a bit silly. Many of these shots are arguably at least as similar as they are different, and once again, I would expect exceptions to everything we're talking about in broad stroke terms. I look forward to seeing, for example, how they approach slow, serious dialogue moments in the movie as well. But once again, generally speaking, I do think that the new trailer showcases elements of the approach I would like to see out of Chainsaw Man. Not giving up the cinematic vibes entirely in every scene, and still taking advantage of a lot of impressive CG compositing work and amazing visual effects, but bringing the character designs and line work more in line with the manga, pumping some vibrance into the colors, and generally simplifying and loosening up the character art and animation for hopefully comedic segments, but definitely the more bombastic action scenes that we've seen so far. I hope and think that what we might actually wind up getting is an art style more in line with the source material, but also more unconstrained animation. Without the need for strict adherence to that sense of realistic, cinematic consistency, more liberties might be taken with how the action animation is approached by each individual artist. Here's just hoping that they stay super faithful to the story's content moving forward, allow just as much freedom with comedic cuts as action, and maybe get a little more creative with how they adapt things like the act of devils passing between worlds as well. Anyway, generally speaking, it just looks great. From what we've seen so far, this movie is at least as dynamic as any part of the first season, and has consistently shown 2D shots of Denji even with his saws out. As good a job as I think they might have done with what they had in season 1, to be fair, I actually liked some of the 3D camera trickery that they employed, which I discussed in my video on episode 4. I'm all for cleverly hidden 3D backgrounds or 2D assets in a 3D environment, in the vein of Heavenly Delusion, Kaiju Number 8, and of course, once again, Chainsaw Man. But the truth is, when your main subject in a 2D anime is 3D, even when it looks good, it looks bad. Because now the focal point of the shot is consistently distracting and uncanny, and not in a good way. At the very least, it looks worse than it would if it were just basically and competently animated in 2D instead. The truth is, the chainsaw never needed to look realistic or super consistent anyway. I would have happily taken a loose, highly stylized 2D saw, and it looks like that's what we're getting here so far. I don't like overhyping anything, and I could be totally and utterly wrong in all my speculation about the new balanced direction, and MAPPA could always potentially just slave drive this production into the dirt, thanks to production schedules which should not feasibly work to begin with. But I think that it looks like we might just be going to get the best of both worlds for this movie. Big dynamic sprawling action scenes, an aesthetic that I think lends itself well to comedy, tasteful, relatively cinematic shots where appropriate, but shots that also still take advantage of the fact that this is animation and not cinema. Take the blue Reize shot for example. The saturated blue and the utterly perfect lighting of the scene doesn't necessarily look realistic, but why should it? It looks aesthetically emotive in a way which only animation can really perfectly capture. Like many of my favorite shots from Call of the Night, it looks perfect in a way which the appeal to realism cannot. I do think that visual mediums like anime should typically take advantage of and embrace the fact that they can have pronounced and exaggerated visual stylizations, unrealistic yet striking visual aesthetics, and big, colorful, bombastically expressive scenes. And if the tone or the type of scene being animated changes, I think that it's perfectly fine to even switch up the overall approach or the style of animation entirely as well. Here's hoping that the anime and staff in general are being given the time that they need to bring a faithful but elevating adaptation with consistent quality and lots of creatively free expression. Anyway, the biggest thing that I really want to say is I'm just so excited for this movie and the anime series moving forward. I don't know if I've said this before, but Chainsaw Man is easily one of my favorite modern shonen manga, and the animation here just looks gorgeous. This isn't personally my favorite arc of the manga, and I would certainly encourage some people to dial back the hype given just how many claims I've seen that this is the best arc, but I definitely enjoyed it, especially our introduction to new characters and the lengthy but dialogue-sparse city-sprawling fight with the Bomb Devil. It's good stuff. I'd say it's the most interesting fight with the most interesting set pieces in the story up to this point, and I can certainly see why it's one of the romantic peaks of the overall series for so many readers. Not least of all, I think, given the arc structure, it's going to make for a perfect movie experience. Here's just praying that it comes to a theater near me. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video, and see ya in the next one.